Hey everyone. Yes, I got lazy, so I decided to use text-to-speech again. Oh well, onto the actual subject of the video. Ben Shapiro has a well-known history of transphobia and homophobia, and while he's said many questionable things about trans people over the years, I thought I'd talk about one of the main claims he and other transphobes have made about trans people, this being that transition doesn't help, or even worsens the mental health of trans people. The claim that sex reassignment surgery, SRS, or gender confirmation surgery, GCS, doesn't improve or even worsens the mental health of trans people is an important point for TERFs for several reasons. It could be used to justify their idea that trans people who want GCS are just delusional, and that they shouldn't be given this treatment, especially for trans youth. They often also claim that we are just letting trans people harm themselves with these procedures, so they could justify being transphobic with the idea that, by being against GCS, they are actually the ones supporting trans people, since they just don't want them to harm themselves. Several health organizations have also made public statements in favor of providing GCS for trans people, so if the evidence contradicted them, big emphasis on if they're transphobes could argue that this is because of liberal or social justice bias in academia, and by extension they could justify to themselves and others that studies and expert consensus often go against right-wing rhetoric only because of bias. I'll address this claim by looking at two studies, one which Shapiro cites in an older clip, and a Swedish study which I've seen a lot of transphobes cite to support this idea. Let's have a look at what Benjamin has to say.
You know, the idea that transgender surgery accomplishes anything for people who are quote-unquote transgender is nonsense. The suicide rates are precisely the same before and after the surgery, and they are both in excess of 40%, which is unbelievably high. Here's the stats, okay? Just 4.6% of Americans altogether attempt suicide. 41% of transgender people do. According to the Williams Institute at UCLA and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, quote, prevalence of suicide attempts is elevated among those who disclose to everyone that they are transgender or gender non-conforming. 50% of people who tell all their friends that they're transgender try to commit suicide at some point. 45% of transgender people who have undergone hormone therapy try suicide. So it turns out that only 41% of transgenders try suicide. That number goes up if you have hormone therapy. The same is true for people who undergo any form of surgery. Actually, suicide rates are the lowest among transgender people who don't want any form of treatment.
Let's have another look at what data Ben gives to support this idea. He points to a report by the Williams Institute, stating that the rate of attempted suicide for the entire transgender population is 41%, while for those who've had hormone therapy it is 45%. For those who had transition-related surgeries it is also higher, varying between 43% to 49%, while for those who don't want transition-related procedures it is lower, varying between 31% to 40%. And indeed, this data does suggest that lifetime prevalence of suicide attempts is higher for trans people who want or have had these procedures. The fact that it only talks about lifetime suicide attempts is an important detail, because this question doesn't really help us compare suicidality before and after transition. If a trans person attempted suicide before treatment, even if their mental health greatly improves after transitioning, the number of lifetime suicide attempts will remain the same. It's not like they can go back in time and change it after all. To properly assess what effect transition has on the mental health of trans people, we have three options. We can ask those who have transitioned how this has affected their mental health. We can compare recent suicidality between those who have transitioned and those who haven't, but want to do so. And the third option, which is the most robust, but also the most difficult to accomplish, is to assess the suicidality of the same group of trans persons over a long period of time, both before and after transition. The first type of study already gives us evidence against Shapiro's claims, as in a 2012 study researchers asked hundreds of trans people how transition affected their suicidality, and the majority of those who had taken hormones or had transition-related surgeries say they've thought about suicide less often and harmed themselves less often. Few reported no difference after transition, and even less said that these issues worsened. While this kind of study already gives us some useful evidence, it's important to note that these kinds of questions are more flawed, since they rely on the participant themselves assessing and comparing their suicidality before and after transition. Nonetheless, while more limited, the results of this study are in accordance with other research on the topic. This survey also reports on the second kind of comparison I mentioned, analyzing the differences between those who want to transition and those who have already done so. Although they don't report on suicide specifically, their results show that those who had undergone transition were also the most likely to report being satisfied with life, while those who wanted to transition, but hadn't done so yet were the most dissatisfied. The same pattern held true for body satisfaction, and with regards to hormone therapy as well. A much bigger and even better study on the topic is the 2015 US Transgender Survey, which asked more than 300 questions to almost 28,000 trans and gender non-conforming persons from all over the US. I'll be referencing a 2019 report by the Williams Institute which focuses primarily on the questions about suicidality, but I'll also link to the full 2015 survey in the description. Unlike the study Shapiro mentions, this survey asked not only about lifetime suicide attempts, but also suicidality and psychological distress over the past year, which gives an even more thorough exploration of the effects that transition has for trans people. On table 4 of the report they analyze how suicidality is related to several gender affirmation milestones, both during lifetime and in the past 12 months. The results show that those who want to transition, but haven't done so report higher suicidality over the past year, and also report a slightly higher rate of lifetime suicidal thoughts and attempts. They also find that those who have taken hormones report lower suicidality in the past year, compared to those who want hormones, but haven't been able to get them, which once again contradicts Shapiro. Finally, for the last kind of study we can look to a meta-analysis from 2010 which analyzed 28 studies on the effects of sex reassignment. According to this analysis, of the more than 1,800 participants in all studies, the vast majority reported significant improvement in gender dysphoria, psychological symptoms, quality of life and sexual function. These studies have their limitations, something which the meta-analysis recognizes as they point out that the data is of low quality. Unfortunately, it is very difficult to study the trans population for a variety of reasons. However, their results are in accordance with other research, and there are basically no large studies showing that transition doesn't affect or even worsens the mental health of trans people. But there is one study that transphobes love to cite to support their narrative that transition is actually bad for trans people. Specifically, I'm referring to the Swedish study published in 2011, which followed 324 trans persons for 30 years. It's a remarkable study in that they were able to follow a reasonably large sample of trans persons over such a long period and compare their mortality to a large sample of cisgender persons. But here's the thing. It doesn't compare suicidality before and after transition. It didn't even ask the trans people in the study about their suicidality before transition. Again, to properly study how GCS affects the mental health of trans people, we need to either assess suicidality before and after transition, or compare trans people who transition to those who haven't, and this study doesn't do either. They compare trans people to cisgender people. And if anything, this study would actually suggest that GCS actually does help. On table 2, they describe the number of suicides in this sample, for a total of 39 attempted or completed suicides. That's 12%, which is substantially lower than the 41% rate of attempted suicide found in the aforementioned surveys. One final thing that's worth noting is that suicide rates were only significantly higher among trans women, as when separating the results by gender the authors found that trans men were not significantly more likely to attempt suicide compared to cisgender women. This is something that other studies following trans people undergoing transition-related procedures also tend to find. So if nothing else, even if we completely ignore all the other research I've talked about in this video, by pointing to this study, transphobes are actually providing evidence that transition does work for trans men, which I think beautifully illustrates how utterly incompetent right-wingers are at actually reading studies. But like I said, this study isn't actually very useful in helping answer this question. When we do look at more relevant studies and actually properly read the evidence and use the facts and logic, there's only one conclusion that we can reach. Transition does help trans people.